Good evening. Tonight, we step into the timeless realm of ancient Greece, where the fates spin their threads and the balance between mortal and divine is kept with quiet precision. This isn't just a set of old warnings, it's a meditation on destiny and measure, on pride and acceptance, on the patterns woven through every life. We'll follow 4 strands on the loom: a king who cannot outrun his fate, a mother whose boast brings sorrow, a weaver who forgets reverence, and a boy whose wings carry him too close to the sun. You may think you know these tales, but there's a deeper wisdom in the way they intertwine, in grief and transformation, and in the ancient understanding that limits can be gifts. If you're enjoying these journeys into myth, a quick like or subscribe really helps. Most of all, I'd love your help making these stories better. Please tell me in the comments how you think I can improve them. Anything that would make them more meaningful or soothing for you. Your feedback shapes what comes next. Now make yourself comfortable, lying down or sitting. Let your breath slow and simply be present. Tonight's tale is gentle and patient, meant to carry you softly toward rest. Let's ease into this journey together, where the loom hums quietly and the stories are as old as starlight. In the soft, unmeasured dusk of mythic time, before the sun learned to count its hours and the moon her phases, there stood a loom. Not in any palace you could walk to, not in any temple where incense rises, but in that quiet place where all beginnings wait, patient as stone, watching as water watches. 3 figures sat at this loom, and their hands moved with a rhythm older than breath. Clotho, the spinner, drew out thread from wool as white as first snow on mountain peaks. Her fingers never hurried, never paused. Each strand emerged smooth and certain, thin as hope, strong as the root that splits rock to find water. She did not choose which thread would be long and which brief. She simply spun, and the thread came forth as it would come. Beside her sat Lachesis, the allotter, whose task was to measure what Clotho had spun. In her hands, each thread found its portion, some stretching long across the loom's width, gleaming in the dim light, like rivers seen from hilltops. Others ending soon after they began, bright and brief as a child's laugh in an empty room. She did not measure by merit or by plea. The thread simply was, and her measuring made it known. At the loom's far end, in the place where all threads must eventually come, Atropos waited with her shears. She was smallest of the 3, they say, but her hands held a terrible gentleness. When she cut, there was no tearing, no violence, only the soft whisper of metal through fiber, and a thread complete. She did not apologize. She did not explain. The pattern required this ending, and so the ending came, clean and whole. These were the Moirai, the apportioners, whom even Zeus himself could not command. Hesiod sang of them in the old days, when poets still remembered how to speak of things beyond the world's rim. They were daughters of night, he said, born when darkness first learned to dream. And what they wove was not cloth for wearing, not tapestry for hanging in halls. It was the fabric of all that moves and breathes, all that begins and ends, all that rises in the morning and lies down when evening comes. The loom stood in shadow, yet nearby, though near is not quite the right word for that country where the Moirai dwell. There was a figure who seemed made of noon's bright edge, where the 3 sisters spun and measured in the dimness of becoming. This other stood as if to cast the only shadow worth noticing. the shadow of excess against the light of due measure. Her name was Nemesis, and the people of Ramnos knew her well. They built her a temple there, on the Attic coast, where the land meets the sea, in a conversation of rock and wave. The sailors passing would pour offerings, not from fear alone, but from a deeper understanding. That pride swells like a sail catching too much wind, and without a hand to reef it in, the mast will crack, and the vessel founder. She was not cruel, this goddess. She did not hunt down joy or punish laughter. But when a mortal voice rose too high, when a human heart began to believe it stood beyond the common measure, then Nemesis would notice, not with anger, but with the same calm attention a gardener gives to a branch that grows crooked, or a builder to a stone that will not sit level. She was the correction that keeps the pattern true. Beside the loom where the Moirai worked, she kept a balance, a simple thing, 2 pans hung from a beam, the kind a merchant might use to weigh grain or a physician to measure herbs. In one pan, always, was placed what was fitting, the honor due to gods, the respect owed to parents, the humility proper to those who walk the earth and will return to it. In the other pan, each mortal placed their words and deeds, their boasts and claims, the weight of their pride or their restraint. Sometimes the scales balanced. Then Nemesis smiled, though few saw that smile, for it was quiet as dawn, and the thread on the loom continued smooth and strong. But when the scales tipped, when the weight of hubris pressed down heavy on one side, then her hand would move. Not with thunder, not with lightning's crack, but with the soft, inevitable pressure of truth returning to assert itself. The loom and the balance, then, thread and measure. These were the 2 great principles that would govern all the tales to follow, though the mortals living through those tales rarely understood, until the pattern had been woven and the scales had stilled. From this quiet beginning, mortals step forward. Their names will become familiar as the night deepens and the stories unfold. A king who could not outrun the thread spun for him before his birth. A mother whose abundance became her emptiness. A weaver whose skill exceeded her wisdom. A boy whose wings carried him too close to the sun's fire. They are separate lives, separate roads walked under different skies. Yet they are akin in this. Each one moves within the warp, and weft the 3 sisters tend. Each one, in their way, will meet the balance Nemesis keeps, though not all will understand it as a meeting. Some will call it fate. Others will name it punishment. A few, at the very end, might recognize it simply as completion. The thread reaching the length that was always its own. The scale settling to its true rest. On a small altar, imagine it there, in the corner of your mind's eye where stories gather before sleep, are placed certain tokens. A spindle wound with thread, a pair of shears, their blades dark with use but clean, always clean. A balance beam, simple and honest, and beside these, smaller things. A carved riddle on a bit of stone, too worn to read clearly in the dimness. A scrap of woven cloth, so fine you might mistake it for spider's work. A feather, white and curved, marked at its tip with a smudge of melted wax. And finally, a handful of wheat stalks, or perhaps they are arrows. It's hard to tell in this light, and perhaps they are both. These tokens rest there without speaking, but they carry in their silence all the weight of what will come. The riddle holds a question that has only one answer. though the one who speaks it may not understand what he has truly said. The cloth whispers of contests, where the prize is transformation. The feather remembers flight, and the price of climbing too high. The wheat arrows, yes, surely they are arrows, though arrows that also promise harvest. They carry both grief and the honor that guards the boundary between earth and heaven. The loom hums in the darkness. It is not a loud sound. You would have to be very still to hear it, stiller than the stillness of falling asleep, as still as the moment between one breath and the next. But it is there, constant and deep, like the sound of blood moving through a body, or wind through a forest that has stood 1,000 years. Clotho spins. Lachesis measures. Atropos waits with her shears, patient as winter, gentle as the first snow that covers what autumn has finished. And beside them, Nemesis holds her balance, watching with eyes that have seen every mortal pride rise and fall, like waves that think themselves permanent before they break upon the shore. There is no moral to this opening, no lesson to extract like a seed from fruit. This is not a sermon. It simply lays the ground, shows the loom and the balance, and invites you to breathe with the measured rhythm of what will follow. The stories that come next are not about punishment, though punishment appears in them. They are not about fate as a prison, though none of the mortals escape what was woven for them. They are about the strange beauty of pattern, the way a thread that seems to wander finds its place in the whole design. They are about the dignity of limits, the grace that comes, sometimes only at the very end, from understanding that the loom is vast, and we are single threads within it, necessary but not sovereign, bright but not eternal. Oedipus will walk toward Thebes, not knowing what he walks toward. Niobe will stand before Leto's altars, her voice strong with a mother's pride. Arachne will sit at her loom, her fingers swift and sure, her heart too certain of its rightness. Icarus will feel the wind lift him, the sun warm on his face, the world falling away beneath his rising joy. And the Moirai will spin and measure and cut, not cruelly, not kindly, but with the deep impartiality of the pattern itself. And Nemesis will watch, her balance ready, waiting for the moment when what is claimed exceeds what is due, when the thread strains against its measure and must be shown, gently, inevitably, the truth of its own length. Outside the window, perhaps, the actual night has deepened. The moon, if there is a moon, climbs her accustomed path. The stars, those distant fires that neither hurry nor rest, continue their slow wheeling. Everything in the real world keeps its measure, holds its place in the vast weaving of sky and earth and sea. Inside, in the space between the teller and the listener, another weaving begins. 4 strands, riddle, stone, web, feather. 4 lives that will show, each in its own way, what it means to live within the loom's domain, what it costs to forget the balance, and what strange peace sometimes comes when the thread is finally cut, and the pattern, at last, can be seen whole. The first thread is already stirring on the loom. A child is born in Thebes, a prophecy already spoken over him, a fate already measured out before he draws his first breath. His thread is long, Lachesis has been generous, but it is tangled in a way that will take decades to unravel, and the untangling will reveal truths that no one, not even the gods who spoke the oracle, could want to witness. But that story waits for its turn. For now, there is only the loom, the balance, and the soft, unmeasured dusk, where all the Moirai's work takes place. There is only the hum of thread through the weaver's hands, the small sound of the scale settling toward true, the patient presence of endings that do not hurry, beginnings that need no announcement. The tokens rest on their altar. The sisters work. Nemesis watches. And somewhere, far away but drawing closer with each word, a man approaches a crossroads where three roads meet, where an old traveler will not give way, where anger and fate and the terrible momentum of a thread spun long before will finally intersect. But that is still to come. The loom hums. The balance waits. The night deepens around the telling, and the story, like all stories told in darkness, told in that gentle hour before sleep, promises not answers but the strange comfort of pattern, the quiet consolation that even our sorrows are threads in a weaving too large to see all at once, too intricate to understand until, perhaps, we reach the place where Atropos waits with her shears, and the thread, at last, is complete. Sleep now, or listen on. The loom does not require your waking attention. It will work whether you watch or dream, whether you understand or simply let the rhythm carry you forward into whatever comes next. The story is patient. The Moirai are patient. Even Nemesis, for all her watchfulness, does not rush the moment when the balance tips. She knows, as the sisters know, as the ancient poets knew, that the pattern will reveal itself in its own time, and no amount of hurry or fear or hope will change the length of the thread that was measured out before the first word of the story was spoken. The tokens wait. The next tale gathers itself in the shadows, and the loom, always the loom, hums its deep and wordless song. Before he had a name that would echo through centuries, before he was a riddle solver or a king or a man who learned too much about his own beginnings, there was only a child, a prophecy, and the terrible hope that fate could be outrun. In Thebes, where 7 gates opened to the world and the dragon's teeth had once sprouted into armed men, King Laius and Queen Jocasta waited for an heir. The waiting had been long, long enough that the king made the journey to Delphi, to that rocky place where the earth breathes up visions and the god Apollo speaks through his priestess's mouth. What Laius heard there was not what he had hoped to hear. The oracle's voice, when it came, was clear and cold as water from a mountain spring. The son born to him would be his murderer. The child would kill the father and, though this part was spoken more softly, as if even the god hesitated before such knowledge, would take his mother to wife. This was the thread the Moirai had spun, measured, and set upon their loom. Lachesis had determined its length and its path, and that path ran through a darkness no parent would willingly enter. But Laius was a king, a man who believed that power could be wielded even against divine speech, that decision could master destiny. When the child was born, a son, as the oracle had said there would be, Laius acted swiftly. He ordered the infant's feet pierced and bound, so that even if somehow the baby survived abandonment, he would be marked forever, known by his swollen feet. Then the child was given to a shepherd with instructions as clear as they were cruel. Take him to Mount Cytheron and leave him there, exposed to the elements and the wild beasts that roam the high slopes. The shepherd climbed. The baby cried, as babies do, not knowing that his cries were supposed to end on that mountain, that his thread was meant, by his father's hope, to be severed before it had truly begun. But the shepherd, when he reached the place of leaving, could not complete the task. Perhaps he heard in the infant's cry his own children's voices. Perhaps the Moirai, who spin but do not explain, had already wound into this thread a small tenderness, a small mercy that would paradoxically lead to greater suffering later. He gave the child to another shepherd, one who served the king of Corinth, far from Thebes. The baby, feet still bound and swollen, was carried down from the mountain not to death, but to a different life, a different kingdom, a different set of parents who would raise him as their own son and love him, never telling him that his blood came from elsewhere. They named him Oedipus, swollen foot, a name that carried his origin in every syllable, though he would not understand what it truly meant until the pattern was complete, and the thread had reached the place Atropos had always been waiting. In Corinth, Oedipus grew. He was strong, quick-minded, beloved by the king and queen who raised him as their heir. He had no reason to doubt that he was their natural son, that his place in the world was secure and known. But at a feast one night, a man who had drunk too much wine spoke words meant to wound. "You are not the true son of the king." It was casual cruelty, the kind that wine often loosens from tongues, but it lodged in Oedipus like a splinter too deep to extract. He asked his parents. They denied it, reassured him, held him as they had always held him. But the doubt, once planted, grew in the darkness of not knowing, like a man who discovers a crack in the wall of his house and cannot stop pressing it, testing it, watching it widen. Oedipus could not leave the question alone. He went to Delphi, the same rocky place where his fate had first been spoken before he was born, the same priestess, or another like her, breathing the earth's vapors, the same god speaking through a human mouth. But the oracle did not answer what he asked. He had come to learn who his parents were. Instead, he heard his destiny. He would kill his father and marry his mother. The horror of it struck him like a blow. He stood on that rocky ground, the wind moving around him, the sky vast and indifferent overhead, and made his decision. He would not return to Corinth. He would never see his mother and father again. For so, he thought of the king and queen who had raised him. He would wander, rootless, but at least innocent. He would outrun the thread. How many times, in how many stories, does a mortal try to step outside the loom's pattern? How many times does that very attempt become the shuttle that weaves the thread exactly where the Moirai intended it to go? Oedipus turned away from Corinth. He walked roads he had not walked before, toward lands he had never seen. His feet, those feet that carried his name and his history, took him, step by step, toward Thebes. The crossroads came upon him without announcement. Just a place where three roads met, dusty and ordinary under the bright sky. From another direction came a small procession. An old man in a wagon, a few attendants, travelers with the impatient authority of those who expect the road to clear before them. There was a confrontation. The old man's herald struck Oedipus, or commanded him to move aside with the tone of one addressing a person of no consequence. Oedipus, who was young, who was fleeing from a prophecy that had shaken the ground beneath his identity, who carried the kind of barely contained distress that can ignite into violence at the smallest spark. Oedipus struck back. It happened quickly, the way these things do. Anger like fire meeting dry wood. A blow given, a blow returned. The old man in the wagon swinging at him, and Oedipus, strong and young and certain that he had already been wronged by fate, fighting not just the old man and his servants, but everything he was fleeing, everything he feared, all the helplessness of being told who you will become, and having no way to refuse it. When it was over, the old man lay dead in the dust of the crossroads. The servants, those who had not fled, were dead as well. Oedipus stood breathing hard, blood on his hands, the sun still bright overhead, as if nothing of consequence had occurred. He did not know the old man's name. Why would he? It was a random encounter on a road, a flare of violence that might happen to anyone. He had been attacked. He had defended himself. That is what he told himself as he walked on, leaving the bodies behind, continuing toward Thebes, because there was nowhere else to go, and because the road led that way, and because the thread pulled him as a current pulls a leaf that thinks it is floating freely. The old man's name was Laius, king of Thebes, father of the child he had ordered left to die on Mount Cithaeron, father of the young man who had just killed him at a crossroads where three roads met. The first strand of the prophecy had been woven. The son had killed the father, and neither knew what had been done. Oedipus walked on and came at last to Thebes. But the city was not as cities usually are, bustling and open, welcoming travelers who might bring trade or news. The gates were closed, the people fearful, the streets quiet with the particular silence that comes when death camps at the threshold. Outside the city, on a rocky outcrop, a creature waited. The Sphinx, not a natural beast, but a thing of divine sending, winged and terrible, with a woman's face and a lion's body, and a voice that spoke in riddles. She had been set there, by the gods, by fate, by the pattern that required this particular knot to be tied and untied, and she asked every traveler the same question. Those who could not answer, she killed. And so far, everyone had failed. The riddle was this: what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Perhaps you know the answer. Perhaps it seems obvious now, in the gentle darkness where this story is being told. But riddles are strange things. They hide the familiar inside the unfamiliar, make the everyday into a puzzle. And the Sphinx's riddle was about the most familiar thing of all, the thing we are, the thing we become. Oedipus heard the riddle, and in his mind, sharp and quick, trained in the court of Corinth, honed by the horror of the oracle's prophecy and the violence of the crossroads, the answer formed: man. Man crawls on 4 limbs as an infant, walks on 2 legs in the strength of adulthood, leans on a staff, a 3rd leg, in the frailty of old age. He spoke the answer. The Sphinx, bound by whatever law governs such things, could not refuse the truth. She threw herself from her rock and died, or vanished, or returned to whatever dark place sends such creatures into the world when the gods need a city tested. Thebes was saved. The grateful city opened its gates. They had a problem, though. Their king, Laius, had left some time ago, and had not returned. He had gone to consult an oracle, they said, and somewhere on the road he had been killed by robbers. The city was kingless, the queen a widow. The people of Thebes looked at this young man who had freed them from the Sphinx, this stranger who had solved what none of them could solve, and they saw in him the answer to their need. He was clever, strong, destined, surely, for greatness. They offered him the kingdom. They offered him, as part of the bargain that makes a foreigner into a king, a marriage with the widowed queen. Her name was Jocasta. Years passed. Long years, good years, or what seemed like good years. Oedipus ruled Thebes with intelligence and care. Jocasta stood beside him, queen and wife. They had children together. The sources differ on names and numbers, but they were sons and daughters, bright young lives growing up in the palace. Proof that the city thrived under its new king's hand. If Oedipus dreamed sometimes of the crossroads, if he woke in the night with the sensation of blood on his hands, he did not speak of it. If Jocasta sometimes looked at her husband and saw in the cast of his face an echo of someone else, or noticed his feet and the old scars there, she kept such observations to herself. The present was good. Why disturb it with questions about the past? But the Moirai, patient at their loom, had not forgotten the pattern. And Nemesis, holding her balance, knew that what seemed level was not level, that beneath the surface of prosperity there lay a weight of truth that had not yet been measured out. The plague came, not slowly, but like a fever striking a healthy body, sudden, virulent, merciless. Crops withered, animals died, women miscarried or gave birth to stillborn children. The city that had thrived under Oedipus's rule now found itself dying, and no one knew why. Oedipus, being who he was, a solver of riddles, a man who had once saved the city by his wit, sent to Delphi again. The oracle's answer came back clear. There is pollution in Thebes. A murderer walks unpunished. The killer of King Laius must be found and expelled, and only then will the city heal. Oedipus began to search. He was thorough, relentless. He called witnesses. He demanded truth. He sent for the blind prophet Tiresias, who could see what others could not see, who walked in the darkness behind the world, where the threads of fate are visible. Tiresias came, reluctant, and when pressed, he spoke. You are the pollution. You are the murderer you seek. Rage is a kind of blindness. Oedipus accused Tiresias of conspiracy, of being part of some plot to overthrow him. But the old prophet, patient and sorrowful, would not retract his words. And slowly, through investigation that was like a man unwrapping bandages from his own wounds, the truth began to emerge. A survivor from Laius's journey, a servant who had fled the crossroads and never spoken of what he had seen. Questioned now, he described the attack, described the young man who had killed the king, the shepherd who had been ordered to expose the infant on Mount Cithaeron, now old, reluctant, but unable to refuse his king's command to speak. He told of the baby with the bound feet, told how he had given the child to another shepherd instead of leaving him to die. The messenger from Corinth, come to tell Oedipus that King Polybus had died, but bringing also the news that Polybus was not Oedipus's true father, that Oedipus had been a foundling, given to the childless king and queen by a shepherd who pitied the infant. Each piece of testimony was a thread pulled, and as they pulled, the whole fabric began to unravel, and what lay beneath was not the pattern anyone had thought they were weaving. Jocasta understood first. Perhaps women always understand these things first, being closer to the mystery of birth, more attuned to the way blood calls to blood. She saw her husband's swollen feet, heard the shepherd's testimony, remembered the baby she had borne, and thought dead. She said nothing to Oedipus. She left him still questioning, still pulling at the threads. She went into the palace, into the private chambers where queens go when they carry unbearable knowledge. What she did there The old stories tell simply, she hanged herself. There is no long description, no dwelling on the moment, just the fact of it, clean and terrible. The thread had reached its end. Atropos had been waiting. The shears closed. Oedipus, still seeking, still demanding truth, followed the thread to its conclusion. The baby with the bound feet was himself. The old man at the crossroads was his father. The woman he had married, the woman with whom he had lain and created children, was his mother. The oracle had been true. The prophecy had been fulfilled, and every step he had taken to avoid it, leaving Corinth, wandering rootless, striking down the old man who attacked him, accepting the crown and the queen as reward for his cleverness, every single step had been the very step that brought the prophecy to completion. He had lived inside the riddle, and now he was the answer. What does a man do when he learns that the pattern of his life has been the opposite of what he thought? That every choice was a step deeper into fate's design? That his intelligence and strength and courage have only served to bring about the exact horror he tried to prevent? In Sophocles' telling, which has shaped all the tellings that came after, Oedipus takes brooches from Jocasta's gown, the golden pins that had held the royal garments in place, and drives them into his eyes, not once but again and again, until the blood runs down and the world goes dark. It is a terrible image, but there is a kind of rightness to it that the old poets understood. He had not seen, truly seen, what was in front of him. He had solved the Sphinx's riddle about man, but not the riddle of his own life. He had eyes, but did not see. And so, in the extremity of self-knowledge, he made the inside match the outside. The darkness he lived in became the darkness he inhabited. Here, in this telling, we do not linger on the violence of it. The brooches, the blood, the cries that must have echoed through the palace. These are noted but not dwelt upon. What matters is the recognition, the moment when the thread is seen whole, when the pattern that was always there becomes visible. At last, Oedipus emerged from the palace blind, his face marked by what he had done, his voice calling out his own pollution. He who had been king, who had been the city's savior, now declared himself the very thing that made the city sick. He asked to be exiled, perhaps demanded it. The ancient sources differ on the details of how it happened, but the essential fact remains. Oedipus left Thebes. The man who had entered the city in triumph, who had solved the riddle and married the queen and fathered children, and ruled with wisdom, now left as a blind beggar, led by a staff, and in some versions by his daughter Antigone, whose own thread would tangle in tragedy later, though that is not this story. There is another ending, though, one that Sophocles also told. Years after the blinding, after the exile, Oedipus came at last to Colonus, a grove sacred to the Eumenides, those ancient goddesses who are called by gentle names because their true names are too terrible to speak casually. He was old by then, weathered by years of wandering. His daughter Antigone still guided him. The people of Athens who held the grove were at first afraid. This was Oedipus, the polluted one, the man whose very presence was thought to bring curse. But he spoke to them, and they heard in his voice not the arrogance of the young riddle solver, but the humility of a man who has been brought all the way down and found at the bottom a kind of strange peace. He told them that he came not to bring pollution, but to bring blessing, that the land where he was buried would be favored by the gods. And in that grove, in the quietness of age and acceptance, the earth opened for him, not violently, but gently, as if the gods themselves were laying an old man down to rest. There was thunder, they say, and a light, and when it faded, Oedipus was gone, not dead in the ordinary way, but taken, received, transformed into something other than a corpse that must be mourned. This is the ending that feels right for a story told before sleep. Not the blinding, though that happened and is part of the thread, but the grove at Colonus, where a man who could not outrun his fate finally stopped running, finally accepted the pattern whole, and found that acceptance itself was a kind of grace. The thread that the Moirai had spun for Oedipus was long and tangled and dark. It led through places no one would willingly go, through parricide and incest, through the discovery that self-knowledge can be agony, through the understanding that the gods or fate, or whatever power moves behind the world, cannot be evaded by cleverness or strength or good intentions. But it led also, at the very end, to that grove, to the moment when the earth opened, to the possibility that even a thread this knotted, this heavy with sorrow, could be woven into a pattern larger than tragedy, could find its place in the whole design that the three sisters tend. The crossroads where Oedipus killed his father without knowing, that place exists. You could travel there if you knew where to look, though time has worn away the markers. The dust is the same dust, the sky the same sky. What happened there happened because a thread was spun before either man was born, and when they met, the thread simply continued to where it had always been going. The riddle of the Sphinx about man, 4 legs, 2 legs, 3 legs, was answered correctly. But the deeper riddle, the one about how a man can try with all his heart to avoid his fate and thereby fulfill it, that riddle has no answer. Or rather, its answer is the story itself, the whole length of the thread from the oracle that spoke before Oedipus's birth to the grove at Colonus where he was taken at his death. Nemesis in this tale is not a figure who appears. There is no goddess descending to punish or balance. Instead, she is present as a principle, as the way that truth, no matter how long denied, no matter how cleverly avoided, eventually asserts its measure. Laius tried to cheat the prophecy and set in motion the very events that would fulfill it. Oedipus, learning the prophecy, fled and ran directly into its arms. The balance that Nemesis holds in this story is the balance between what we wish our lives to be and what they are, between our plans and the pattern, between the illusion of control and the reality of the loom's design. It is not a cruel balance, though it feels cruel to those caught in its weighing. It simply is, like gravity, like time, like the way a river must eventually reach the sea. And so the first of the 4 threads is complete. Oedipus has walked his road from Thebes to Corinth, to the crossroads to Thebes again, and finally to Colonus. The Moirai have spun and measured and cut. Nemesis's balance has shown its measure. The plague has lifted from Thebes, because the pollution was named and expelled, and the city could breathe again. But we, listening in the darkness, take away something more than just a story of suffering. We take away the image of a man who, having learned the worst truths about himself, did not merely collapse into despair, but found a way to continue, to walk the remaining length of his thread, with a dignity earned by absolute honesty. The staff that Oedipus carried in his blindness, that third leg that makes him, in a way, the answer to the Sphinx's riddle, even in his ending. That staff is a symbol we can hold. It means that when sight fails, when the world becomes dark, when everything we thought we knew about ourselves proves wrong, still there is a way to walk forward. Still there is a path, even if we must tap it out one step at a time. Even if we must trust in someone else's eyes. Even if the only destination is a grove where the earth will open and receive us. The crossroads is behind us now. The riddle has been spoken and answered. The thread has been cut or transformed, or whatever happens to threads when Atropos finishes her work, and Nemesis's scale settles at last into balance. But the loom still hums in the darkness. There are other threads, other patterns. The second tale is gathering itself, and it speaks not of a single man's fate, but of a mother's pride, and not of a crossroads, but of altars and a mountain, and not of a riddle to be solved, but of a boast that could not be taken back once spoken. The tokens on the altar have shifted. The staff and the riddle stone rest now in the shadows. Coming forward, catching the dim light, are arrows, beautiful and terrible, and beside them a piece of stone that might have once been a woman's face, and a length of thread so finely woven it seems almost alive. Sleep comes closer, or perhaps we go deeper into the place where stories live. Either way, the loom hums on, and the next thread begins to show its color. There are two kinds of wealth in the world. The first is the kind you can count: gold and land, cattle and grain, the solid things that fill storehouses and make a kingdom strong. The second kind cannot be weighed or numbered, but it is no less real: the wealth of children, of skill, of lineage and name. Niobe of Thebes possessed both. She was queen, wife to Amphion, the musician king, whose lyre had called stones to build the city's walls. She was mother, and here the ancient sources differ in their counting, but all agree on abundance. 7 sons and 7 daughters, says one tradition. 6 of each, says another. Some count more, some less. But the number matters less than the plenty itself. The sense of a household so full of young life that it seemed to overflow its bounds like a fountain in spring. She was also daughter of Tantalus, that king whose name became a word for torment, and granddaughter of Zeus himself. Divine blood ran in her veins, however thinned by mortal generations. When she walked through Thebes, people stepped aside not just from respect, but from a kind of awe at so much fortune gathered in one person. And perhaps that was the beginning of it, not the pride itself, which might have remained a private thing, a quiet satisfaction in blessings received. But the way that fortune pressed upon her until she could not help but speak of it, could not help but measure herself against others and find them wanting by comparison. The day it happened, if there was one particular day, though the old poets tell it as if there must have been, was a festival day. The women of Thebes were going in procession to honor Leto, the goddess who was mother to Apollo and Artemis, those bright twins who move through myth with their arrows and their music, their punishments and their protections. Leto's altar stood ready. Incense would be burned, prayers would be spoken. The proper offerings would be made to acknowledge the goddess's power and grace, to say, "You are greater than we are, and we remember this, and we are grateful for your attention when you choose to grant it." Niobe saw the procession forming, and something rose in her. Not anger exactly, but a kind of heat, a pressure that had been building perhaps for years under the weight of her many blessings. She stepped forward, and her voice carried over the crowd with the certainty of one who has never been contradicted. "Why do you honor Leto?" she asked. "Why burn incense to a goddess who hides herself on distant Delos, who wanders without a city to call her own? I stand before you. My father was Tantalus, my grandfather Zeus himself. My husband is king. His music moved stones. Look at my children. How many stand strong and beautiful, a glory to their parents and their city." She gestured to where her sons and daughters stood. The sources disagree on the exact number, but imagine them as the poets did. Young men tall and skilled in all the arts of war and rule. Young women lovely and accomplished, each one a promise of future households, future grandchildren, future continuance of the royal line. "Leto has 2 children," Niobe continued, and here her voice took on an edge that perhaps she did not fully intend. Or perhaps she did. Perhaps the pride that had been swelling in her for years needed to speak itself fully at last. 2 children, and for this she demands worship. I have, and here she named the number, whether 6 or 7 or more, and I stand before you in the flesh, not hidden on some barren island. If divinity deserves honor, then honor me. Let the incense burn on my altars instead." The women of Thebes stood frozen. Some looked at the ground. Others looked at Niobe with the kind of horror that comes when you witness someone step off a cliff. That moment when they are still walking, still confident, not yet aware that there is no ground beneath their feet. But Niobe was not afraid. Why should she be? She was queen. She was blessed beyond measure. And surely, after so many blessings, after such clear favor from fate, or fortune, or whatever power distributes the goods of life, surely she had earned the right to speak truth as she saw it. The women drifted away from Leto's altar, not because they agreed with Niobe, but because what else could they do? She was their queen, and perhaps, too, because her confidence was such that it made their own devotion seem foolish, made them doubt for a moment whether the invisible gods truly had more claim to honor than this visible, abundant, undeniable prosperity. Far away, on Delos, Leto heard. The gods always hear when mortals speak their names, and especially when mortals speak them in comparison, in that particular tone that suggests measurement and finding wanting. She was not a goddess of wrath, like some. Her story was one of wandering and refuge, of being pregnant and pursued, of finding no place willing to shelter her until the barren island of Delos offered its rocky ground for the birth of her twins. She had suffered for her children before they were born, and she loved them with the fierce protective love of one who has had to fight for every blessing. But she did not need to act herself. She had her children, and they, Apollo of the silver bow, Artemis the huntress, they heard their mother's quiet grief, felt the insult as if it had been directed at themselves. They came to Thebes, not announced by thunder, not preceded by omens, but simply there, as gods can be, visible or invisible as they choose. They stood outside the city with their bows, those beautiful deadly instruments that the old poets loved to describe. The curve of horn and wood, the string drawn back, the arrow nocked and ready. Niobe's sons were practicing in the fields outside the city. Young men do this, gather to run and wrestle, to practice with spears and ride horses, to build the strength that kingdoms require of their princes. They were laughing, probably. The sources don't say, but imagine them laughing, easy in their youth and vigor, unaware that their mother's words had traveled to divine ears, unaware that the balance Nemesis keeps had been tipped too far. The first arrow flew, then another, then more, as steady as rain. Apollo was shooting, his aim perfect as sunlight, finding the smallest gap in clouds. Each arrow found a sun. Not all at once. The old poets let the horror unfold deliberately, let each death be witnessed. The young men fell, some immediately, some with time enough to call out, to understand that something impossible was happening, that they were not just dying but being killed, being removed from the world by a force that would not miss, would not tire, would not stop until the work was done. In the city, news came running. Niobe heard, first confusion, then the terrible clarity as messenger after messenger arrived. One son dead, another, the number mounting as the afternoon wore on, as Apollo's arrows continued to fly. She rushed to the field, too late to prevent, only in time to witness. Her sons lay in the grass, in the dust, beautiful, still but empty, the way bodies are empty when what animated them has fled. She saw Apollo standing there, his bow still ready, his face not angry but simply resolved, doing what must be done when measure has been broken. Perhaps she tried to speak. Perhaps words came out, pleas or curses or the kind of animal sounds that grief makes when it is too large for language. But Apollo did not respond. He had done what he came to do. The sons were gone, every one of them. But he was not finished, or rather Artemis was not finished, for Niobe had daughters too, and the insult had been to both the twins, and the balance required complete correction. The daughters had fled to the palace, gathering in their mother's chambers as children do when danger comes, seeking safety in walls and familiar rooms. But walls mean nothing to gods. Artemis came, her bow as sure as her brother's, her resolve as steady. The arrows flew, the daughters fell, one after another, until the chamber that had been full of young life. Imagine them clutching each other. Imagine the oldest trying to shield the youngest. Imagine their voices crying out to their mother, who could not protect them, until that chamber was full instead of silence, and the terrible stillness that comes when Atropos has worked quickly, cutting thread after thread after thread in swift succession. Niobe stood among the bodies of her children, all of them. The sources differ on the exact number, but they agree on this, all. The household that had been so full it seemed to overflow was now empty. The abundance that had justified her pride was gone, cut down in a single afternoon by arrows that did not miss, could not be dodged, came from gods who loved their mother and would not allow her honor to be diminished. What does a mother do when such a thing happens? When the pride of the morning becomes the desolation of the evening? When every blessing is revoked in the time it takes for the sun to cross the sky? In some versions, Niobe spoke again, even then, even surrounded by her children's bodies. She spoke to Apollo and Artemis, those implacable archers, and her words were not repentance, but a last flare of defiance. I have suffered this, and still I remain. I am still more than Leto, for she has only 2 children, and I had. But the number she had named that morning could no longer be spoken in the present tense. In other versions, she was simply silent, the kind of silence that is itself a sound, a negative space so profound that it draws everything into it. But all the versions agree on what came next. Amphion, her husband, killed himself, some say by his own hand, some say by Apollo's continued arrows. The kingdom was left without heir, without future, and Niobe, alone, carrying grief too large for a human body to contain, began to change. Not suddenly, or perhaps it was sudden. The poets differ, and perhaps it doesn't matter whether transformation takes an instant or unfolds over days. What matters is that stone began to appear in her, or perhaps she was becoming stone, her flesh hardening, her bones turning to rock, her whole being shifting from the warm softness of life to the cold permanence of mineral. She fled Thebes. Or she was carried, or she simply found herself moving, drawn by some instinct deeper than thought, back to her homeland, back to Lydia and the slopes of Mount Sipylus, where her father Tantalus had once ruled, before his own pride brought him to eternal torment. There on the mountain, the transformation completed. Niobe became stone, not a statue carved by human hands, but a natural formation, an outcrop of rock that suggested the shape of a woman. And here is the strange mercy of it, if mercy it was. The stone wept. When rain came to Sipylus, when the winter storms moved through, or the spring melt began, water ran down the stone face that had been Niobe's face. Locals would point it out to travelers. There, see how the rock weeps. That is Niobe, still grieving, still carrying the loss that turned her to stone. The transformation was punishment, but it was also preservation. As stone, she would not have to endure the long human years of aging, without children, without purpose, without the future that children represent. As stone, she could hold her grief without being consumed by it, could weep without ending, could remain as a marker and a memory of what happened when measure was forgotten and pride spoke too loud. Homer knew this story. In the Iliad, when Achilles must comfort Priam over the death of Hector, he tells Niobe's tale, not to mock suffering, but to show that even grief must eventually yield to the necessities of life. Niobe, he says, remembered to eat, even after her children were slain. She became stone, yes. But before that, there was the meal, the simple act of continuing, the way even the most profound sorrow must eventually accommodate the body's needs. It is a strange comfort, perhaps, but comfort nonetheless. That grief does not have to be total, that one can lose everything and still, in some way, continue. That transformation itself, even to stone, might be bearable if it allows the hurt to be held without destroying the holder. The balance that Nemesis keeps is visible here in stark relief. Niobe's pride was her children, and so her children were taken. She had compared herself to a goddess, claimed more honor than the divine, and the scales, which had been tipped by her own words, her own measuring, settled back to true through loss. Not because the gods were petty, though the old stories sometimes make them seem so, but because the pattern requires proportion, because excellence without humility is a thread pulled too tight, a weight that must be countered. Yet there is tenderness in it, too. The weeping stone, the memory preserved not just as warning, but as witness to a mother's love, a mother's loss. Even in punishment there was acknowledgement. She had loved her children truly, even if she had boasted of them wrongly, and that love, turned to stone but still weeping, became part of the landscape, a permanent reminder that pride and grief are close neighbors, that abundance requires humility, that blessings can be lost as quickly as arrows fly. But Niobe's thread is not the only one in this chapter. The loom holds another pattern, another figure who found excellence in her hands and let it lead her beyond the boundary of due measure. In Lydia, the same land where Niobe's father had ruled, where Mount Sipylus rose and the weeping stone would later appear, there lived a girl named Arachne. She was no one special by birth. Her father was a dyer, a worker of wool, a craftsman of the kind that makes a living, but not a name. The family was not poor, but neither were they rich or royal. What Arachne had was skill. Skill with thread and loom. Skill so profound that it seemed to transcend the merely human. When she wove, the cloth that emerged from her loom was not just functional, but beautiful. Beautiful in a way that made those who saw it stop and stare. That made even other weavers shake their heads in wonder. People came to watch her work. They would stand in the doorway of her father's house, silent, mesmerized by the way her hands moved, the way the shuttle flew back and forth, the way the pattern emerged, as if the cloth were designing itself and her hands were just following its lead. "Athena must have taught you," they said. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and craft, the patron of weavers, the one who had invented the loom and given its secrets to mortals. It was meant as a compliment, a recognition that skill this great must have divine source, divine blessing. But Arachne heard it differently. Perhaps she was young. The poets tell us she was young, though they don't say exactly how young. Young enough to mistake excellence for invincibility. Young enough to believe that what her hands could do made her the equal of anyone, even the gods. "Athena did not teach me," she said, and her voice was clear and certain. "My skill is my own. Let Athena come and compete with me, if she dares. Let her set her weaving beside mine, and we will see whose is better." It was said casually, perhaps. A young woman's pride in her own achievement, her frustration at having her work attributed to divine teaching rather than her own genius. But the words once spoken could not be taken back. They rose like smoke from an altar, like the scent of spilled wine, and they reached the ears they had named. Athena came, first as an old woman, bent and gentle, leaning on a staff. She found Arachne at her loom and spoke softly, the way elders speak when they try to turn a young person from a dangerous path without breaking their spirit. "You are skilled," the old woman said. "Perhaps the most skilled mortal weaver living. Be content with that. Claim your excellence among humans, but do not challenge the gods. Ask forgiveness for your boast, and the goddess will forgive you." Arachne looked at the old woman with the kind of scorn that youth sometimes feels for age, that certainty that old advice is outdated, that the world has changed, and the old rules no longer apply. "I said what I meant," Arachne replied. "Let Athena come. I will not take back my challenge." And then the old woman was not an old woman. The disguise dropped away like a cloak falling, and there stood Athena herself, tall and gray-eyed, her presence filling the room with a light that was not quite light, a pressure that made the air itself feel heavier. The watchers who had been standing around Arachne's loom fell to their knees. Even Arachne's father, if he was there, would have prostrated himself. But Arachne, having spoken her challenge, stood straight, not from bravery necessarily, but from the same pride that had made her speak in the first place, the same certainty that her hands could do what they could do, and that ought to be enough. "Very well," Athena said. "Let us weave." 2 looms were prepared, the same size, the same quality of thread, the same tools, everything equal, everything fair. And then they began. Athena wove swiftly, her hands moving with the practiced ease of divine craft. The pattern that emerged on her loom was a celebration of divine order, the gods in their glory, their victories over the chaotic forces that threatened cosmos. There in the center was the contest for Athens, the city that bears Athena's name, the goddess offering her gift of the olive tree, Poseidon striking his trident against stone to bring forth a saltwater spring, and the citizens choosing Athena's gift as more valuable. In the corners of her weaving, Athena placed small scenes, mortals who had challenged gods and been transformed for their presumption. Warnings, if one knew how to read them. A reminder that the boundary between human and divine exists for a reason, and crossing it ends not in triumph, but in change. The cloth was perfect, every thread in its place, every color true, the images clear as if they were windows into another world, rather than fiber and dye. But Arachne's weaving was perfect, too. She worked with the same swift certainty, her hands flying across the loom, the shuttle moving so fast it seemed to blur. The pattern that emerged from her work was different, though. Where Athena had shown divine glory, Arachne showed divine trespass. She wove the loves of the gods, not the official couplings, not the marriages sanctioned by myth and ritual, but the others. Zeus pursuing Europa as a bull, Leda as a swan, Danae as golden rain, Apollo and his various conquests, Poseidon and his transformations. She showed the gods at their most undignified, their most deceptive, their most driven by desires that made them behave not like the immortal powers worthy of worship, but like spoiled children taking what they wanted without regard for consequence. And the craft of it, the technical execution, was flawless. Every detail clear, every figure accurately rendered. The cloth seemed almost alive, the scenes so vivid that you could imagine them moving, could almost hear Europa's cry as the bull carried her across the sea. Athena finished her weaving and looked at Arachne's work. And here the sources differ on what happened next. Some say the goddess could find no fault with the weaving itself, that technically, artistically, the work was indeed perfect. Others say that Athena was angered not by the quality, but by the content, by the disrespect shown in choosing to depict the gods in this way. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the problem was precisely that the work was perfect, that a mortal had achieved something that ought to be beyond mortal reach, and had used that achievement not to honor the divine, but to expose it, to criticize, to suggest that the gods were not worthy of the worship demanded of them. Athena struck the loom, or struck the cloth. The gesture differed in the telling, but the intent was clear. This is not acceptable. This cannot stand. What happened next unfolds with a terrible quickness. Arachne, seeing the goddess's anger, seeing perhaps for the first time what she had really done, not just challenged Athena in craft, but challenged the entire order of things, the hierarchy that places gods above mortals, and demands reverence, even when the gods themselves behave badly. Arachne felt the weight of it crash down on her. She reached for a rope, the impulse toward self-destruction that comes when pride collapses all at once, when the certainty that sustained you vanishes and leaves nothing but shame and fear, and the realization that you have gone too far, said too much, claimed too much. But Athena caught her, or caught the rope, or perhaps simply spoke a word that stopped the girl's hand before the knot could be tied. Because the punishment, if it was punishment, was not death. Death would be too simple, too final. The pattern required something else. "You want to hang?" Athena said, or might have said, or perhaps just thought, while her power flowed out to reshape the mortal body before her. Then hang, but hang living. You and your descendants. You wish to weave without acknowledging my teaching, then weave forever. The transformation took hold. Arachne's body contracted, shrank. Her arms and legs multiplied, became 8 thin, jointed things. Her torso compressed into segments, her face simplified into eyes and mandibles. Everything that made her human was taken away, and what remained was a spider, Arachne in the Greek tongue, the word that still names her kind. But she could still weave. That skill was not taken from her, perhaps because it was too essential to who she had been, or perhaps because the punishment required it. She could still create webs, still work with thread, still make patterns of astounding delicacy and strength. The difference was that now she would do it forever. Now she would spin from her own body, would weave not tapestries depicting gods and mortals, but simple nets for catching prey, for survival rather than art. Now her work would be seen but not admired. People would brush away her webs, call them cobwebs, destroy in a moment what took her hours to create. It was a lessening, certainly. A fall from human to arachnid, from artisan to pest. But it was also a mercy in its way. She lived. She retained her skill, even if the context was changed. And in the long view, the view from the loom where the Moirai work, where patterns that seem cruel in the moment might prove necessary to the larger design, perhaps it was the only way to preserve what was essential about her while correcting what had gone wrong. The lesson of Arachne is more subtle than Niobe's. Niobe boasted, openly, compared herself directly to a goddess, made her claim public and loud. Her punishment was correspondingly clear. What she boasted of was taken away. But Arachne's pride was quieter, more defensible. She was skilled, genuinely skilled, not delusional. Her challenge might have seemed reasonable to someone who believed that excellence ought to speak for itself. That talent earned the right to claim its own worth without bowing to external authority. Yet the pattern required something different. Excellence, the story suggests, is not enough by itself. Skill must be joined to acknowledgement of where skill comes from, to humility about one's place in the order of things. Not false humility, not pretending to be less than you are, but true humility, understanding that even your greatest achievements are gifts in some sense, are built on teachings and traditions that came before you, are held within a context larger than yourself. Athena did not punish Arachne for being skilled. She punished her for refusing to acknowledge the divine source of craft, for using her skill to demean rather than honor, for crossing the boundary between mortal and immortal, not with respect, but with scorn. And yet, because Athena is not only a goddess of punishment, but also of wisdom, the punishment was measured. Arachna became a spider, yes, but spiders are remarkable creatures, patient, precise, creative, capable of producing from their own bodies something beautiful and functional. In the transformation, something of Arachne's essence was preserved, even as the form was changed. 2 women, then, 2 threads, woven into this chapter's pattern. Niobe, who boasted of her abundance and lost it all, becoming stone that weeps when rain comes. Arachne, who claimed skill without humility and became a spider, weaving forever, but weaving webs instead of tapestries. Both met Nemesis, not as a goddess who appeared with scales and declarations, but as a principle woven into the fabric of how mortals and gods relate. The principle that says, there is a measure to things. Pride has its place, joy in your children, satisfaction in your craft. But when that pride grows to claim equality with the divine, when it forgets that blessings can be revoked and gifts can be taken back, then the balance must be restored. The Moirai's threads run through both stories. Niobe's children, each with their own thread, all cut short in a single afternoon. Arachne's thread, not cut but transformed, continuing but in a different shape, and overhead the same 3 sisters spinning and measuring and cutting, their work unchanged by mortal pride or divine anger, simply continuing as it has always continued, will always continue, must always continue if there is to be any pattern at all. Homer, that ancient voice who saw so much and sang so well, used Niobe's story to comfort Achilles when his grief over Patroclus seemed too great to bear. Even Niobe ate, Homer reminds us. Even after such loss, the body's needs continue, and tending to them is not betrayal, but simply what it means to continue living. There is wisdom in that. Perhaps not the wisdom Niobe would have wanted to impart, but wisdom nonetheless. That grief, however profound, does not exempt us from the ordinary requirements of being alive. That transformation, however strange, might be survivable. That even stones can weep, and that weeping is itself a kind of persistence. And Arachne's story offers its own teaching. That skill, no matter how great, must be joined to wisdom about when and how to display it. That challenging the gods might be done with perfect craft and still be wrong in tone, in context, in the meaning it carries beyond the technical execution. That a pride in one's work is right and good, but pride that refuses all context, all relationship, all acknowledgement of debt to others and to the divine. That pride is a thread pulled too tight, a pattern distorted, a balance tipped that must right itself. The altar where the tokens rest has changed again. The arrows have been used. They rest now in shadow, their work done. The weeping stone sits beside them, small and smooth, marked with channels where water might run. And beside it, a strand of spider silk, so fine it's almost invisible, but strong, stronger than you would think for something so delicate. The loom hums. The pattern continues. 2 more figures have walked their roads, met their transformations, found their places in the weaving. But there is one more thread to follow, one more tale to tell before the night is done, and sleep can come with its own deep patterns, its own mysterious weavings. The last story is gathering itself in the shadows. It smells of salt and sun, of wax warming and feathers rustling. It speaks of a father's warning and a son's bright, brief flight. It asks what happens when counsel is given and not heeded, when the middle way is shown but the heights call too strongly, when wings that could carry you to safety instead carry you toward the sun. But that waits for the next chapter, the final thread. For now, rest with Niobe's stone and Arachne's web. Let them settle into your mind like seeds in earth, waiting for whatever understanding will grow from them when morning comes, and the stories have had time to work beneath the surface of waking thought. The balance is still, the loom still hums, and the next tale, of wax and feathers, of a father's grief and a sea renamed, waits just ahead, patient as the dawn that will eventually come, as patient as Atropos with her shears, knowing that every thread must reach its end, and that the ending, when it comes, will be exactly as long as the pattern requires. The last tale comes like a sea breeze before sleep, carrying salt and the memory of sun on water, the scent of distance and the particular quiet that settles over waves when the wind dies down and evening approaches. On Crete, that island kingdom where the great King Minos ruled, where the labyrinth coiled beneath the palace like a dark thought beneath a crown, where the bull from the sea had fathered a monster that could not be spoken of in polite company. On Crete, there lived a craftsman whose name meant something like cunningly wrought. Daedalus, builder and inventor, artist and engineer, a man whose hands could shape wood and stone and metal into forms that seemed to transcend their materials, that seemed almost to breathe and move on their own. He had come to Crete from Athens, fleeing, the old stories say, from a murder he had committed, though the details vary and perhaps don't matter to this telling. What matters is that he came, and Minos welcomed him, and his hands put themselves to work in service of the kingdom that had granted him refuge. It was Daedalus who designed the labyrinth, that impossible maze beneath the palace, built to contain what could not be killed, but must not be allowed to roam free. The passages wound and doubled back, split and rejoined, rose and descended, until anyone entering would be lost immediately, helplessly, with no hope of finding the way out unless they possessed a thread to mark their path. But the maze held more than just the creature it was built to contain. It held also the secret of its own construction, and that secret lived in Daedalus's mind. And Minos, wise in the ways of kings, suspicious in the way of men who hold power, understood that such knowledge was dangerous. A man who knew how to escape the labyrinth might share that knowledge, might give it to someone Minos wanted trapped, might use it himself to flee the island and take his secrets to Minos's enemies. So Minos kept Daedalus on Crete, not in chains. There was no need for that. The sea was chain enough. Minos controlled all the ships, commanded all the harbors. He put out word to the surrounding islands and kingdoms, "If Daedalus arrives in your port, send him back." And so the craftsman, who had built the most famous prison in the world, found himself imprisoned by the same intelligence that had made him valuable. Daedalus had a son, Icarus, the sources call him, though they tell us little else about the boy. Was he born before Crete, brought with his father from Athens, or born on the island, a child of exile? The stories don't say clearly, and perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is that he was young enough to trust his father completely, young enough to see impossibility as just another puzzle his father would solve, young enough to mistake confidence for invincibility. They lived well enough on Crete. Minos was not cruel, and Daedalus's skill made him valuable, worth feeding and housing and treating with respect. But a cage with gold bars is still a cage. and Daedalus, whose mind could not stop working, whose hands itched to make and shape and solve, looked at his confinement and began to think. Minos controlled the sea. Yes, every ship, every harbor, every sailor who might be bribed or convinced to carry passengers. The land was the king's. The roads and passes were watched. Every conventional route of escape was sealed as thoroughly as the labyrinth had been designed to trap. But Minos did not control the sky. Birds flew over Crete without asking permission, without checking in at harbors, without being counted or taxed or turned back. They rose from the island on wings that seemed effortless, climbed into air that belonged to no king, and disappeared over the horizon toward whatever destination called them. Daedalus watched the birds. He watched the way they tilted and turned, the way their feathers caught the wind, the way they balanced between sky and sea, too high to be caught by waves, too low to be burned by sun. And in his watching, a design began to take shape. He gathered feathers, started small, plucking them from dead birds, collecting molted feathers from beaches and cliffsides, then larger, more systematic. Perhaps he trapped birds, though the stories don't dwell on this. Perhaps he simply waited and gathered what the island provided. Either way, over weeks or months, he accumulated enough. The long flight feathers from wings, the smaller covert feathers that gave shape and smoothness, the down that provided lift and warmth. He arranged them carefully, in the order they would sit on a bird's wing. Largest at the outer edge, smallest near where they would attach to the body. He bound them together with thread, strong linen thread, the kind sailors used. And where thread was not enough, where the structure needed more binding than fiber could provide, he used wax. The beeswax of Crete was famous, golden and fragrant, soft enough to work with warm hands, firm enough when cooled to hold shape and provide structure. Daedalus warmed it over small flames, dripped it carefully over the thread bindings, let it cool and solidify until the feathers were held not just in place, but in relationship to each other, each one contributing to the whole structure in the way they did on a bird's actual wing. He made 4 wings, 2 for himself, 2 for Icarus, tested them, adjusted them, refined the design until the balance felt right, until they curved the way wings should curve, until lifting them created the sensation of air resistance that meant they would catch the wind, would translate movement into lift. And when they were ready, when the design was as complete as he could make it, without actual flight to test it, he called his son and began to explain what they would do, and how they would do it, and most importantly, how they must not do it. "Listen carefully," Daedalus said, and his voice carried the weight of a craftsman who understands his materials, who knows exactly where the tolerances lie, where the design will hold, and where it will fail if pushed beyond its limits. "These wings will carry us. I have tested the design. The feathers are sound, the binding is strong, the wax will hold. But you must fly the middle course. Do you understand? Not too low, not too high. The middle way." Icarus nodded, his eyes on the wings, those impossible, beautiful things his father had made, those instruments of freedom that would lift them away from Crete and carry them toward what? Home, perhaps, though home for the boy might mean anywhere his father was, any place that wasn't an island prison. "If you fly too low," Daedalus continued, "the sea spray will wet the feathers. They will become heavy with moisture. They will lose their shape, and you will fall. The sea is not our friend in this. We must stay high enough that the waves cannot reach us." The boy nodded again. This made sense. Everyone knew that wet feathers could not fly. Birds caught in storms, their plumage soaked, floundering and helpless. But if you fly too high... And here Daedalus's voice became even more serious, even more weighted with the need for this lesson to be heard and held and remembered. If you climb too close to the sun, the heat will soften the wax. The binding will fail, the feathers will scatter, and you will fall just as surely as if the sea had claimed you. He gripped his son's shoulders, looked into his eyes with the intensity of a father who knows he is about to trust the most precious thing in his life, to an untested design, to the boy's own judgment, to forces beyond his control. The middle way, Icarus. Not too low, not too high. Keep me in sight, follow my path, and we will reach safety together. Did Icarus understand? Did he hear not just the words, but the meaning beneath them, the knowledge that this was not just instruction about flight mechanics, but about something larger, about the necessity of measure, about the danger of extremes, about staying within the bounds that craft and wisdom have established? Perhaps he thought he understood. Young people usually do. They hear the warning. They nod agreement. They genuinely believe they will remember and follow the counsel given. But between hearing and doing lies the great gap where so many warnings fall unheeded, where the moment's excitement drowns out memory, where the heart's desire pulls stronger than the mind's resolve. They strapped the wings to their arms. The binding was clever. Daedalus had thought through how to attach them securely without restricting movement, how to make them extension of the body rather than burden carried. When Icarus lifted his arms, the wings lifted with them, spreading wide, catching the morning air. Father and son stood at the top of a tower, or perhaps on a cliff. The sources differ on the exact location, but somewhere high. Somewhere where they could step into air rather than having to run and jump. Somewhere where the first moments of flight would not be complicated by obstacles or insufficient space. Daedalus went first, lifted his arms, felt the wings catch, stepped forward into empty air. There was a moment, there must have been a moment, of pure terror, of falling, of the absolute certainty that this could not work, that he had miscalculated, that gravity was stronger than cleverness. But then the wings bit into the air, the feathers flexed and held, the waxen thread binding did its work, and he was not falling but gliding, arms working now in the rhythm he had practiced on the ground, pulling down and back, feeling the lift, feeling the miracle of it. A human being held aloft by craft, by design, by understanding applied to materials and shaped into function. He looked back. Icarus was standing at the edge, wings spread, face bright with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Then the boy stepped off, and his wings caught too, and they were both aloft, both climbing into the air above Crete, both heading toward the horizon where freedom waited. Below them, the island shrank. Farmers in fields looked up and cried out. Whether in wonder or fear, the sources don't say. But imagine both. Imagine seeing what you have always known to be earthbound suddenly in the sky. What you have always known to be human suddenly winged. What you have always known to be impossible suddenly occurring above your head. A shepherd on a hillside stopped and stared, his mouth open. A fisherman in his boat grabbed his companion's arm and pointed upward. Later people would talk about what they had seen, some saying it was gods, others saying it was a trick of light, others insisting they had seen exactly what their eyes reported. Men with wings, flying like birds, disappearing toward the north. Daedalus kept to his course, the middle height between sea and sun, the measured path that acknowledged both dangers. His arms worked steadily, the rhythm becoming natural, becoming almost restful in its repetition. He checked behind him frequently, making sure Icarus followed, making sure the boy was keeping close, keeping safe. And at first, Icarus did. He flew where his father flew, matched his movements, stayed in formation like a young bird following the parent who knows the way. The wings held. The morning was perfect for flying, cool enough that the wax stayed firm, warm enough that the air had body, gave lift. But then, and this is where every telling of the story settles into its inevitable, tragic groove, the boy began to feel it, the joy of it, the impossible, exhilarating, addictive joy of flight. He was doing something no human had done before. He was held by nothing but feathers and wax and his father's genius. He was free, not just free of Crete, but free of weight itself, free of the earth's pull, free of every limitation that had ever bound human movement. His heart lifted. Perhaps literally, perhaps he could feel it lighter in his chest, beating faster, full of a kind of rapture that must be akin to what gods feel, what birds feel, what anything that was born to fly feels when the wind is right and the sky is open and nothing stands between you and wherever you might go. He climbed, just a little at first, just to feel what it was like to rise rather than glide level. The wings responded beautifully. The air grew thinner but also brighter, cleaner, more golden as he ascended toward where the sun hung, enormous and radiant. His father's voice came from below, calling his name. Icarus heard it, distantly, and meant to respond, meant to descend again, to return to the safe middle path. But the sun was so beautiful, the height was so glorious, and surely, just a little higher would be safe. The wax was firm, the wings were strong. His father was brilliant, but also cautious, perhaps too cautious. Perhaps the danger was less than he had said. Perhaps there was room for joy, for celebration, for testing what these marvelous wings could truly do. He climbed higher. The sun grew larger, its heat more intense. Still he climbed, his young heart full of something like love, like worship, like the kind of ecstasy that makes people forget every warning they have ever received, because the present moment is too powerful, too beautiful, too absolutely consuming to resist. The wax began to soften, not all at once. If it had failed suddenly, there might have been a moment of realization, a chance to dive and save himself. But it softened gradually, the way wax does when heated, losing its solidity degree by degree, becoming pliable, then sticky, then liquid. The feathers began to loosen. First one, then another, slipping free of their bindings, drifting away on the wind like small white prayers that no one would answer. Then more, faster, as the structure of the wing began to fail, not just in one place, but everywhere, the wax running now, the thread bindings useless without the wax to hold them. Icarus felt it, the sudden lightness that was not the lightness of flight, but the lightness of dissolution. The wings were coming apart. He grabbed at them, as if his hands could hold what wax could not, as if will could substitute for structure. But the Moirai had measured this thread too. Lachesis had determined its length. and the length was this: from birth to a certain morning over the sea between Crete and the mainland, from first breath to the moment when wax melted and feathers scattered, and a boy who had climbed too high began to fall. He cried out. We can imagine he cried out, though the stories don't tell us his final words. Perhaps he called for his father. Perhaps he simply made the wordless sound that comes when the body realizes it is no longer held, when the thing you trusted absolutely proves untrustworthy, when the next moment will bring either rescue or ending, and you have no power to determine which. Then he was falling. Not the controlled descent of flight, but the helpless plummet of a weight released. The air rushed past him. The sea below, which had seemed so distant, so safely far beneath the path of flight, now rose toward him with terrible speed. His father saw, was probably already turning back, already sensing something wrong, before he saw the scattered feathers floating on the wind, before he saw the dark shape of his son tumbling from the sky. Did he cry out too? Did he try to dive, to catch the boy, to do something, anything, that might change what was already determined, already cut, already complete? But wings made for gliding cannot dive swiftly enough to catch a falling body, and the distance was too great, and the thread was already severed. Atropos had done her work, and what Daedalus had built with such care and cleverness could not hold back the shears that cut at the appointed moment. The measure that had been set before the wings were even imagined. Icarus struck the water. The sea received him the way the sea receives everything that falls into it, without judgment, without ceremony, simply closing over the surface where a moment before there had been splash and foam, and then, soon, nothing but waves, continuing their ancient rhythm. The sea was later named for him, the Icarian Sea, that stretch of water between the islands and the mainland, where a boy fell from the sky and disappeared. Sailors passing through would tell the story, pointing to the water as if it were marked somehow, as if you could see where it happened if you looked carefully enough. But water keeps no marks. It closes over tragedy and triumph alike, and an hour later there is no way to tell where anything entered it. Daedalus circled back. The sources say he searched, calling his son's name, flying low over the waves, looking for, what? A body to retrieve, some sign that the boy might somehow have survived, or just the desperate need to not leave, to not fly on to safety without at least bearing witness to where his son had fallen. He found the body eventually, found it floating, or found it washed to shore. The details blur in the telling, as if even the ancient poets could not bear to linger on this moment, on a father gathering his dead son from the sea, on the weight of that small body that should have been light, should have been held by wings, should have been safe if only the warnings had been heeded. Daedalus buried Icarus on an island, a small ceremony, quick and private. A father's grief is too large for words, too deep for ritual. He piled stones over the grave, or perhaps carved a marker. The sources differ, but however it was done, he left his son in the earth and took to the air again, because what else could he do? The wings still worked, his own binding still held, and staying would not bring the boy back, would not undo the fall, would not change the fact that counsel had been given and not followed, that the middle way had been shown but the heights had called too loudly. Daedalus flew on. He reached Sicily eventually, or perhaps some other hospitable shore. The geography matters less than the fact of arrival, of survival, of continuing when continuing seemed impossible. He was received kindly, the stories say. A king welcomed him, put his skill to use in ways that served rather than imprisoned. He built no more wings, or if he did, the stories don't tell of it. Perhaps once was enough. Perhaps the cost of that flight, bought with his son's life, was too high to contemplate repeating. Perhaps he returned to more earthbound crafts, temples and theaters and mechanisms that stayed safely on the ground where they belonged. But his name became synonymous with the highest craft, the most cunning design, the ability to look at impossible problems and find solutions that transcended previous understanding. And his son's name became synonymous with something else. The bright promise of youth, the joy that climbs too high, the heedlessness that mistakes confidence for invincibility and pays for the mistake with everything. There is no villain in this story, no angry god sending arrows, no balance that needed correcting through divine intervention. The punishment, if punishment it was, came from the nature of things themselves. Wax melts in heat. This is not personal. This is not divine judgment. This is simply how wax is, how sun is, how the relationship between the two functions according to laws that govern matter, regardless of who is working with it or what their intentions might be. Nemesis appears here not as a figure, but as a principle, so fundamental it barely needs naming. The principle that limits exist for a reason, that boundaries are not arbitrary impositions but acknowledgments of reality, that the middle way is not cowardice but wisdom, not compromise, but the only sustainable path between extremes that will destroy you. Daedalus knew this. He has spent his life working with materials, understanding their properties, learning where they were strong and where they would fail. He passed this knowledge to his son in the form of clear, specific instructions. Fly the middle course, neither too low nor too high. But knowledge must be joined to discipline. Instruction must be joined to the will to follow instruction, especially when the heart is pulling the other direction, when joy is urging you higher, when the present moment seems so perfect that future consequences feel distant and abstract. Icarus was not evil. He was not even particularly foolish by the standards of youth. He was simply young, and the young often believe, must believe perhaps, in order to have the courage to attempt anything, that warnings are overly cautious, that they themselves will be the exception, that what happened to others will not happen to them, because they are different, special, blessed. The tragedy is that he was not different. The wax melted for him, just as it would have melted for anyone. The wings failed for him, just as Daedalus had known they would fail if the conditions were exceeded. The sea received him just as it would receive any falling body. The thread that the Moirai had spun for Icarus was bright and brief. Lachesis had given him enough length for childhood, for the years on Crete, for one morning of flight. Not enough for the mainland, for adulthood, for the long life his father would live afterward. The pattern required this specific length, this specific ending, and when Atropos cut, it was neither sooner nor later than it had always been going to be. Yet there is beauty in the story, too. Not in the ending. The ending is simply sad. The waste of promise, the preventable death, the father's grief. But in the fact that the flight happened at all, that a man looked at imprisonment and found in birds the key to freedom. that human intelligence joined to craft and courage could achieve something that had never been achieved before. For a time, brief as it was, Icarus flew. He knew what it was to be held by air, to see the world from a height reserved for birds and clouds, to move through 3 dimensions with a freedom that no walking creature can imagine until they experience it. Those moments were real, were true, were his to experience, even though the experience ended in falling. Perhaps this is the other lesson, the one that sits beside the warning about limits, that attempting the difficult, even the apparently impossible, has value, that using intelligence and craft to transcend our natural bounds is part of what makes us human, that there is a kind of nobility in the reach, even when the reach exceeds the grasp. The balance, then, Nemesis's balance, is not between attempting and not attempting, but between reach and measure, between the ambition that drives us to build wings and the wisdom that counsels flying the middle course, between the father who designs and the son who soars, between possibility and limit, aspiration and caution, the heart that wants to climb and the voice that warns against climbing too high. The tokens on the small altar have shifted one final time. The riddle stone and the staff from Oedipus's tale rest in deep shadow now, their work done chapters ago. The weeping stone of Niobe and the spider's thread of Arachne sit beside them. Memorials to pride, checked and transformed. And in the center, catching what little light remains, are a few white feathers and a small lump of wax, still bearing the impression of the thread it once bound. These 4 tales, the threads of Oedipus and Niobe, of Arachne and Icarus, are separate stories, separate lives lived under different circumstances by different people. Yet they are woven together by the principles that gave them shape. The work of the Moirai, spinning and measuring and cutting without favor or mercy, but also without cruelty, simply maintaining the pattern that is larger than any individual thread, and the balance of Nemesis, that quiet insistence that measure must be kept, that pride must be checked, that limits exist, and ignoring them brings not freedom, but destruction. The loom where the 3 sisters work has been present throughout, sometimes visible, sometimes felt only as a hum beneath the surface of the stories, every thread that has been followed. Oedipus's long and tangled path from prophecy to recognition to acceptance, Niobe's bright abundance and its sudden ending, Arachne's skill and its transformation, Icarus's brief flight and shorter fall. Every thread took the shape it took because the Moirai were spinning and measuring and cutting, according to a design too large to see whole from within it. And Nemesis, holding her balance, has been watching, not with anger. She is not angry, not with pleasure in suffering. She takes no pleasure in the corrections she oversees, but with the steady attention that the pattern requires, the vigilance that notices when pride exceeds due measure, when mortals claim equality with gods, when boasts are made that challenge the order of things, when the sun's heat is ignored and the middle way abandoned. The night has deepened around this telling. Outside the space where the story lives, the actual world continues its own patterns, stars wheeling, seasons turning, threads being spun and measured and cut in the lives of people who will never know their stories became part of ancient tales. Inside the telling, in the gentle darkness where these old myths have unfolded, there is a settling, a sense of completion, a feeling that what needed to be said has been said. The four tales together make a larger pattern. Oedipus teaches that fate cannot be outrun, that the thread spun for us will reach its length, no matter what cleverness we employ to avoid it, but also that acceptance, when it finally comes, can bring a kind of peace. His story ends not with the blinding, terrible as that was, but with the grove at Colonus, with the earth opening to receive him, with transformation that suggests even the darkest thread has its place in the whole design. Niobe teaches that abundance without humility is a tower built on sand, that blessings are not possessions to be boasted of, but gifts that can be recalled, that comparing ourselves to gods is forgetting the vast difference between mortal and immortal, temporary and eternal. Her story ends with the weeping stone, which is both punishment and preservation, both warning and witness to the depth of a mother's love, even when pride has led to loss. Arachne teaches that skill must be joined to wisdom, that excellence in craft is not enough if it lacks reverence, that challenging authority, even when the challenge is backed by genuine ability, requires understanding the context in which you work. Her story ends with the spider's web, delicate and strong, beautiful and functional, a reminder that transformation need not mean total destruction, that something can be preserved even in the changing. And Icarus teaches that joy must be measured, that the heart's desire must be balanced against the world's realities, that warnings exist not to diminish us, but to keep us safe, within the bounds where life is possible. His story ends with a sea renamed, with scattered feathers, with a father's grief, but also with the memory of flight, the knowledge that the attempt was made, that for a time the impossible was achieved, even though it could not be sustained. The Moirai continue their work. Clotho spins, her fingers never tiring, the thread emerging white and clean and ready for whatever pattern it will enter. Lachesis measures, determining for each thread its proper length, some long, some brief, none given more or less than the design requires. Atropos waits with her shears, and when each thread reaches the point where it must end, she cuts cleanly, without hesitation, without regret, without the possibility of error, because the pattern itself determines where the cutting must occur. They do not hurry, they do not rest, they simply work, as they have worked since before time was counted, as they will work until the last thread is spun and measured and cut, and the pattern is complete, though that completion lies so far ahead that even the gods do not speak of it, and perhaps it will never come. Perhaps the work is eternal, the loom always humming, the threads always emerging and being woven and reaching their ends. And Nemesis stands nearby, not beside the loom exactly, but in that place where principles live, where the necessity of balance asserts itself whenever imbalance appears. Her scales are empty now, settled at equilibrium. The stories have been told, the measures have been taken, the corrections have occurred. Until the next time, and there will always be a next time, always someone who forgets, or ignores, or simply cannot resist the pull of pride, the urge to claim more than is due, the desire to climb higher than craft allows. Until then, the scales rest quiet. What do we take from these stories as sleep approaches, as the tales settle into memory where they will work in ways we cannot predict or control? Not rules exactly, not commandments, The old myths do not tell us what to do. They show us what was done and what followed, and leave us to draw our own understanding from the showing. But perhaps this, that we are threads in a pattern larger than ourselves, that the length and color and texture of our thread was determined before we began, and straining against that determination serves only to tangle the pattern, not to change it. That acceptance of our place, not resignation, not passivity, but deep acceptance of what we are and what we are not, brings a peace that struggle cannot achieve. Perhaps this, that pride is not wrong in itself, but pride that forgets its context, that claims too much, that measures itself against the divine and finds itself equal. That kind of pride invites correction. That boasting of children, of skill, of achievement is natural and human, but it must be tempered with gratitude, with acknowledgement that gifts can be given and taken, that we hold our blessings contingently, on loan from powers we do not control. Perhaps this, that limits exist not to punish us, but to protect us, that the middle way between extremes is not cowardice, but the only sustainable path, that when someone older and wiser says, "Do not fly too high," they are not trying to diminish your joy, but to preserve it, to help you continue experiencing joy beyond this single moment of ecstasy. Perhaps this, that transformation is not the same as destruction, that becoming stone or spider or falling into the sea is terrible, yes, but that something persists even through the transformation. Niobe's grief in the weeping stone, Arachne's skill in the spider's web, Icarus's flight in the sea's new name, Oedipus's journey in the grove that blessed the land where he was received. The loom hums in the darkness. It is the last thing we hear as the story completes itself, as the four threads, riddle, stone, web, feather, are gathered into the larger pattern, as the Moirai's hands continue their work, and Nemesis's balance remains ready for the next weighing, as sleep comes closer, and the boundary between story and dream grows thin. In that gentle space between waking and sleeping, between the told tale and the rest it invites, perhaps we can hear it. The rhythm of the loom, the soft whisper of thread through the weaver's hands, the nearly silent snip of Atropos's shears cutting some far thread that is not ours, not yet, but will be someday when our measure is complete, and the pattern requires our ending. It is not frightening, this sound, or if it is frightening, the fear is mixed with something else, with the peace that comes from understanding that we are held by something larger than ourselves, that our individual threads, however tangled or bright or brief, contribute to a design we cannot see whole, but can trust, is being woven with care. The altar where the tokens rest is quiet now. The riddle has been answered. The arrows have found their marks. The loom has woven the threads of pride and measure. The wings have carried their burden as far as they could, which was not as far as hoped, but was perhaps as far as the pattern allowed. Outside, in the actual world where bodies rest and breath slows and the night performs its own mysteries, other stories are beginning, other threads being spun. A child is born somewhere, a prophecy already hovering over them, whether spoken or not. A weaver sits at her loom, fingers swift and certain, not yet knowing what her skill will cost or win. A boy looks at birds and dreams of flying. A mother counts her blessings and feels the weight of their abundance. The same principles apply to them that applied to the ancient figures whose stories have just been told. The Moirai still spin, measure, cut. Nemesis still keeps her balance. The pattern continues to be woven, thread by thread, generation by generation, story after story after story. But those tales are for another night, another telling. For now, there is only the quiet after the last story, the settling that happens when a narrative has reached its natural end, the sense of completion that allows sleep to come without resistance. The loom hums. The balance rests in equilibrium. The shears are clean and ready. And the four tales, Oedipus at his crossroads, Niobe with her many children, Arachne at her contest, Icarus in his flight, rest now in memory, in that place where old stories live, waiting to be told again, waiting to offer again their strange comfort, that sorrow and joy are both threads in the pattern, that loss and transformation are not endings but changings, that even our darkest moments are held by something larger, are necessary to the design even when we cannot understand how or why. Sleep comes, or let it come. The stories have done their work. The myths have offered what myths offer. Not escape from the world, but a way of seeing it that makes it bearable. Not answers to our questions, but deeper questions that honor the mystery of being alive, of being threaded into a pattern we did not choose, but can choose, perhaps, to accept. The loom will still be humming when you wake. The balance will still be waiting for the next measure. The shears will still be clean and sharp and patient. But for now, rest. For now, sleep. For now, let the rhythm of the stories carry you down into whatever dreams the night prepares, knowing that you too are a thread in the great weaving, that your length was measured before you began, that when the cutting comes it will be neither too soon nor too late, but exactly when the pattern requires it. And until then, until Atropos lifts her shears and the thread you are reaches its completion, there is the middle way to walk, the measure to keep, the balance to honor. Not too proud, not too reckless, not claiming what is not yours to claim, but also not denying what you are, not refusing the gifts you have been given, not avoiding the thread that is uniquely yours to follow. The stories are done. The night is deep. The loom hums its ancient song, and sleep, that small sister of death, that gentle rehearsal for the final cutting, opens her arms and welcomes you into the dark where all patterns are woven, all threads return to stillness, all measures are complete. Rest now. The tales will wait. The Moirai will wait. Even Nemesis, holding her eternal balance, will wait. And the morning, when it comes, will bring its own threads, its own patterns, its own small choices about how high to fly, how much to claim, how to walk the measured path between the extremes that call from either side. But that is tomorrow's work. Tonight there is only the story told, the pattern shown, the gentle rhythm of the loom carrying you down into sleep, where even the Moirai rest, where even Nemesis lowers her scales, where even the most tangled threads find temporary peace in the darkness that holds all stories, all threads, all lives woven and to be woven in the vast design that has no end. Sleep. The loom hums. The pattern continues, and you are held, have always been held, by the three sisters who spin and measure and cut without mercy, but also without cruelty, simply maintaining the great weaving that is everything, everyone, every moment that ever was or will be. The book closes. The night deepens. And the last sound, softer even than breath, is the loom, always the loom, humming its deep and wordless song.